So there's been a lot of talk over the Paradigm Founder series, which use acoustic lensing as well. And this is basically how KEFs work. So I don't know how their lensing works. After Andra Jones went around and started basically just splooging the KEF patents all over the place ever since their 1980s patent started expiring, KEF had to reverse engineer their own patent and work from the outside in, something they call total system design. So their entire driver actually works, or is now actually covered to work from the outside in and from the back to the fore, to the back. Check this out. So you're listening to these speakers right now, right? These are actually the original reboots that started them all. This substance right here is the same substance that this is made out of, and the same substance that this is made out of. What they doped the 3000X woofer out of. This paint right here is the same paint that they used on here to make the matte sides on the Metas. You can actually see like the silica doping in there if you turn on the flashlight. You can see the sparkle. Okay, well, check it out. So we're listening to these, right? And you would think you're hearing them straight from the front, so you're hearing the tweeter, right? Sound would be emanating out from here, and then you'd think you're hearing sound emanating also from the coaxial, right? Like the concentric woofer. But what you're actually hearing is sound coming from only the woofer. It's all merged, so that even from the front, there's no hot spotting. These are actually a lot thicker than they seem. If you look at them from an angle, you'll kind of notice they're actually like kind of diamond shaped. But from the distance, they kind of look like they're just little fins, right? But they cover a good about 1/3 of the rear. So if you were to take, actually I lost where it was because I took a whole entire driver apart. So I have every single component to this driver, which is a lot of components. Like there's actually a whole stack of magnets behind this thing. Like almost like casino chips that are smart magnets where they don't have any actual magnetic polarity. They will explode as soon as you remove the tweeter. They just blast out, and that's actually how I broke two of them. And so the way they work is no matter which way that you set them up, you can squeeze them together and they'll actually snap together. But if you just jostle them, they'll pop apart again, and they're extremely strong. I'll link a video to show how strong they are, but the coil, just like on the blade, sits right here on the inner rim, while the striations right there are actually little fins. These little fins work almost like the way that heat sinks work, where there's more surface area on the back than there is in the front. And so they also apply the Bernoulli principle, so that, you know, when you blow between two sheets of paper or like a boat jet streams to shoot air, to basically blast air through the sails so that you can actually sail upwind. These, as they're pistoning, create pockets of air of extremely low sensitivity. There's actually a big pocket in here that's right behind the tweeter. That's how it bends, and there's 6 holes on the outside. 6 or 8, actually I forgot, I have to check again. And the way that the holes bend, they bend out through these little fins. out through these little channels. And the way that the back of the tweeter resonates actually ends up resonating the fins as much as the actual piston of the woofer itself does. So they actually both work in unison. So the back of the woofer basically turns into a passive AMT. If you listen to just the woofer by itself, it sounds like a full range speaker. But yeah, so from the front, you get no shotgun effect, because the sound you're actually hearing is sprawling and actually rebounding, and you're actually hearing it coming out from, depending on the timing of course, come out from as rings converged from anywhere from here out to the woofer, out to even the shadow flare here. And then the front of this thing is actually a crescent shape that allows for the sound to be more evenly dispersed or widely dispersed than tall. So it actually limits the ability for this thing to disperse sound horizontally, because you don't want floor and ceiling reflections, because that's typically not how people record sound, right? But yeah, so it doesn't only apply to this. As a segue piece, since I did take this thing apart, this right here is actually the seal that seals the gasket. It's actually a gasket between the tweeter and the woofer. It allows for this thing to be such a high pressure device that you could blast it, and this is actually a gasket seal in the seam right here too. And if you blast it, you could blast it up to, I played it up to 180 hertz just to stress test it, and thought I burnt out the tweeter, but I didn't. It turns out that the tweeter wire just kind of popped off, so I was able to just reconnect it, and it actually ended up working fine. It didn't overheat or anything. This thing is over-engineered like it's for like a freaking one-way mission to Mars or something. But yeah, this is something that might look familiar to you, to some people, right? So the way that they made this was so that the tweeter would fit in here and prevent air from leaking from between the woofer and the tweeter, so that it would be completely airtight and allow for the pressure vessel. And the internals with the rear AMT with being fed with a tweeter that's actually capable of playing up to 55 kilohertz plus or minus 3 dB, and it's the last tweeter to be capable of doing so, is because the rear of the tweeter is in a chamber that's so large. It actually needs to be able to control the rear of its sound so well that it's able to guide and strum these fins and basically make them power the AMTs, turn these fins and the very high sensitive air laden between them into AMTs, and then the air eventually circulates in this phi proportioned cabinet that's crescent from the front and round in the back, and the mouth for the port is right in the top corner and feeds out diagonally out the back port this way, and it feeds out diagonally so that no matter which way you face it, the port could never reflect off the back wall or anywhere that would actually affect the phase. So the port is actually as loud as the driver itself, and the port isn't there to actually raise isn't actually there to raise the amount of bass. It's not meant to be a bass bump. If you look at the 3000X, you'll notice that it looks like it has an artificial bass bump, but the bass bump is at 2.2 kilohertz. The ports of these things are actually at 54 hertz, same as for these guys, which also have a 2.2 kilohertz phase, and 2.2 kilohertz crossover between the tweeter and the woofer, and also has a 54 hertz port. It's also the same phi relationship. Phi is 1 2.618. But this thing couldn't actually have the same amount of pressure vessel. Like it couldn't sustain the amount of pressure without leaking air outside of this little crevice right here, because it doesn't actually have the gasket seal, which now all the drivers across the board have. So ever since they released the Metas, they added the crescent seal. So now the new Metas actually have a crescent seal in between there and there. It's not visible, just like it's not visible here, but it's just kind of back behind there, and it prevents air from chuffing. And that chuffing would lead to both like a sound of coagulation and shoutedness, because this thing's meant to work kind of like a clock, where this thing uses, like the tweeter uses this tangerine waveguide as its, waveguide, as kind of an acoustic lens to flatten the air and control the dispersion of the dome tweeter, to make sure that the dome doesn't just poke the air, but hits the air evenly across the whole entire surface area, which is what allows for the sprawling of the air around the horn, so that you could just cover the front and it doesn't affect the sound at all. Listen to the high frequencies. Hear the crackle? Doesn't affect it at all. So when you're listening from the front, you're basically hearing it from the woofer this way. When you're listening to it from a tilt, which is actually ideally how you're supposed to, you're hearing the tweeter and the woofer merge here. Like no matter which direction you're facing, this parabola always has a direction that will reflect the sound directly at you, with the merging of the woofer and the tweeter, so that way it is able to achieve the whole single point design. The design of this tweeter is actually the same exact design that was used to design this tweeter. In fact, I could take this thing out and put this thing in there and it would work perfectly fine. This parabola shape right here is the same exact shape as this. The only difference is that this is stamped titanium aluminum and it doesn't have the rear fins. The only ones that have the rear fins, or sometimes they call them ribs, is the blade and these. And now they just basically use these again as prototypes for the T-series and got the ultra slimline woofers. So the ultra slimline woofers still use the low striation fins too. And the fins don't just cause the back to become pretty much an AMT powered by the tweeter and the pistoning, but because they're fins that have to resonate, they end up actually sucking any any past resonance, any residual resonance from the surface of the woofer and strengthening it. So this thing is always taut. This thing is always basically being stretched so that it's extremely stiff, and they're able to hit the targets of I believe it was 3% and below, up until 300 hertz, which is where the voice is seen to begin. So then they could cross over the woofer with the blade at I think they cross over at 300 or 350. So this right here, as you can see, is exactly the same size and the same exact angle. They basically just loaded up the CAD file and just continued working on it, because the sound that would come out of this thing was engineered to sound exactly like this thing. These ripples on the outside here are meant to kind of work like the rear striations, in the sense where you're able to hear through the speaker, and it's trying to achieve the pressure vessel effect without actually being a pressure vessel. Listen to the sound of like the depth of the field. Oh shoot, I'm not recording actually in stereo right now, am I? You might be able to hear it. I'm gonna switch to the L50s. Hear how it flattens? See, this actually sounds like the air and everything is actually like. I have a binaural recording where you can actually hear like the zeros and ones, and it creates like this stereoscopic sound where it basically sounds like your Atmos, because that's what stereo was originally about. And these were a reboot of the LS35As, the first standardized stereo pair. So they had to be stereo in the truest sense. And originally stereo was actually stereophonic, as in, you know, stereoscopic, as in 3D sound. So switching back to the LS50s, and you'll find that you can do the same thing here. You're actually not hearing the tweeter from the tweeter at all. See? In fact, I'll find it is a bigger piece. It's just, I'm using one hand. Can I plug this thing in here? Get this thing plugged in here maybe, and hold it up like that. See, as long as sound can sprawl, so where is the sound coming from? So where are the high frequencies coming from if I could cover the tweeter? And there's no actual change or drop off in the sound of the tweeter. You can use a spectrograph if you want. The sound's actually coming from here. This isn't just a surround. It's called the Z-Flex. And it's actually made of the same material as this stuff right here. And it's meant to be acoustically active. And they're engineered to be the flat portion around what used to be the flat portion around the Q and the IQ and the Generation 6 2007s. And what became the muons, essentially. Here, I'll show you. See how this horn right here is surrounded by a parabola, and then there's a flattened section right here? Well, this flattened section right here is bounded on the outside, so that no matter how much this woofer woofs, this horn will always strike these striations right here. And these striations right here work like passive AMTs, just like the back of these things. So you're actually, if you feel these, you actually feel like they're resonating. So they're basically very similar to what, like the polydome concept of what Infinity did when they ran out of money for Kapton. Infinity used to use Kapton for their emits, and they were like the best sounding tweeters. But I guess Kapton got really expensive with the space race and everything, so they started using foams instead. And the rubber shortage and stuff like that caused like all sorts of issues. So people also started making foam surrounds, and that caused foam rot. So all sorts of issues happened. But these guys, they started making silicone rubber surrounds. These are no longer butyl rubber, but they're actually also acoustically active. They're extremely thin. Notice how like they're barely like. These things are actually thicker than these things are. So you're actually hearing the same exact dynamics. When I cover the front, you're hearing the sound sprawl, so that either you're hearing it from bouncing off of the woofer this way as a ring, or you're hearing it from the many like resonating kind of circular array of tweeters, like almost like AVRs, but for tweeters around the outer rim. And that outer rim will always be stricken by the wave, because this horn and the outer edge of the Z-flex are bound. So as this thing pistons, no matter what the angle of this thing, and the sprawling of the tweeter will always remain consistent, and it'll continue to bring sound forth toward you. And the same thing applies when you're listening to him sideways. Sound is now being reflected from here to there, and you're hearing sound hit you from the parabola, whatever area of the parabola is facing you. So the sound ends up being converged either this way when you're off axis, or this way where you're on axis. So no matter what, you're actually getting a full, like a single point image with no shotgun effect. And that's how they got rid of the shotgun effect, and why they have such an elaborate setup, and why it took like so many years that these actually became 2 entire generations. They're actually generation 7 and generation 8. When you look up the Uni Q Tech Museum, they're listed literally twice, as if they give, as if they're immaculately conceived or something. Generation 7 gave birth to the 2nd edition, generation 8, which is the same thing as these, but the older ones didn't have the tweeter. And so at 2.2 on forward, the tweeter was actually ducked lower, so it appeared as if there was actually a mid-bass bump. But once they added the horn phase, tweeter, tangerine, waveguide, acoustic lens, it increased the efficiency of the tweeter to the point where it matched with the crossover to flatten the response curve, such that I could share a video where you could hear the summing of these two or the summing of these two, and they sound exactly like the center speaker that was created, and that was the voice model that was created so that the phantom center would sound exactly like the actual center that they made that was custom for the 3000X series. So yeah, you notice like the love of phi. See like the shape here, like the width to height, and this is the low frequency section to the 3000X series. They call it a sub, but it should actually be treated as a low frequency section. It doesn't even have sub controls. It should just be played inline, and it actually crosses over perfectly, and is timbre matched perfectly with the 3000X series, and with the XQ series, and with the LS series. So if you wanted to find something that would actually fit. And what's cool about it is that it's actually a single point low frequency two-way I guess bass section, low frequency section. So you're kind of just switch back and forth. I'm trying to get the angle. Yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe if I had a stencil or something like that, we could probably line it better. But yeah, they actually end up doing the same thing with this thing. The width to height on this, the front is convexed as opposed to this. This is actually contoured, like it's concaved, like the pod to the blade. So this thing's actually, it allows it to perform as if it doesn't have a baffle, so you could place it on its side. And this thing right here is the waveguide that would be the only thing that matters, so it's completely symmetrical. Whereas this thing, when you place it on its side, it would actually emanate sound more this way than this way. And they actually did make one that was sideways, and they didn't make it crescent shaped for that reason. Because the center speaker, you wouldn't want it to be crescent. You wouldn't want it to, not spread the sound as wide. So they made the center speaker flat, with the rear being like almost like you took a cheese wheel and cut it in half. So, or you took this thing right here and cut it in half. I don't have a model of it with me right now, but actually I think I do. Yeah, so this is actually the center, and I got this just to pretty much play around with. But notice how they didn't make the front crescent shaped. They just relied on the actual baffle to do the job, and that's what remains of the woofer I took apart. And you can see the side venting right there. That gigantic chamber is actually what housed the tweeter, and those vents on top lead right into the fins and resonate with the fins as the rear of the tweeter back waves and escapes that way, and is drawn that way because that's what the woofer normally does as it's drawing its air outward. Because notice the horns, notice how like the lines aren't parallel, and naturally just sucks air out that direction anyway, which is how the tweeter's rear waves would actually just end up being pretty much like evacuated from the rear of the tweeter. And why the tweeter had to actually play all the way up to 55 kilohertz was because it actually needed to have that much control of the rear of this thing, and basically simulate the sound of the inside of the ideal room, almost like it was a micro Sydney Opera House or something. Their use of phi actually started back with Gen 6, which I found really interesting, and I actually want to see other speakers. I want to see if other speakers are actually gonna pick that up too, because it's a very, very cool concept. Check this out. So these are like my babies right here. These are actually like hybrids of the XQ and the IQ series. And what's cool about them is that they're sectioned off here, they're sealed from here, and they're sealed from here, and all the way down to the bottom. And these ports are elliptical, and they're elliptical to allow them to be broad bandwidth. And even like, I think it was Stereophile, I noted that the ports were strangely tuned to be an octave higher than you would actually imagine they should be. And the reason why is because the ports aren't supposed to be there to boost the bass. That's not the purpose of the ports. The port is actually there to control the airflow, obviously, but also to transmit the shape of this thing. See how there's like a single bowed piece of wood in the back and a single bowed piece of wood in the front? So it's basically an ideal chamber. It's an ideal room. If you could have your room be this shape, and you would probably put your speakers like right here, and you put your couch like right here, and everything would sound great. And so they pretty much did the same exact thing, and allowed for that sound to exit out of the port. So that way that these things are as important as these things. These things aren't just add-ons to make these things sound lower. These things are there to basically allow for this thing to sound like it's one full panel of sound that's able to play the out of phase and in phase sound, and fill your room with sound in a way that would sound as if you were actually there in a live recording session. But they didn't get the tweeter perfected yet. You can still cover it. See? You can still hear like that it does actually rely on some forward radiation. Like it chops off just a tiny bit of the shimmer. And that's because look at the size of this horn. The horn wasn't really like perfected to be able to allow for the perfect sprawling of the sound yet. But pay most attention to this thing. This is actually the old tweeter too, when it was IQ90. Notice this flat portion right here, and then this flare portion right here. This flat portion right here runs right into this regular butyl surround, right? So this is actually the upgraded version, and it has like from the XQ, we got it from the XQ40s. So it's still able to have, it still sounds better. It still has like the hyper tweeter sound. It has like the sound that is able to, it just sounds more like a emit, like a what's it called? Like a ribbon tweeter. And that's the sound that I like. And rather than having to be, in one area, this style of emit, or kind of pseudo emits, where they actually flatten the air pressure along the tweeter by making it so that they use a dual diaphragm tweeter that's made of titanium, and they make, look how flat the actual tweeter is. It's almost like the tweeter is like cut off of like a sliver of a bowling ball versus cutting it off of cutting a ball in half. The tweeter is practically flat. So it's really being guided by this thing and this thing. And then this flat portion right here is the remainder of what allows the woofer or the mid woofer to woof. And notice how it actually matches profiles with this thing. I thought that was kind of cool too. And that's why this thing has these bullet plugs. Is pretty much to simulate what this thing does. While the original IQ90s didn't have these bullet plugs. They just had the regular round dust caps. So note that the size of this thing is like half an inch, or 3/4 of an inch, and then there's a flare, and then a flat portion here, right? So take note of that. So this right here is to this, as this right here is to this. So basically it's sealed off here and sealed off there. And that's basically feet, again, in motion. So that these two, when they're actually playing in parallel, because this is actually a three-way speaker. So that's one-way, two-way, three-way. These are supposed to play in electronic parallel, but they don't. They actually play out of sync. These actually play about 300 to 600 milliseconds behind these ones. And you actually, if you use like a slow motion camera or a strobe light, you can actually watch, so they actually lag. And that's deliberate. These speakers are really hard to measure for that reason, because they're actually deliberately meant to mess with the sound of the bass in a way that sounds like you're actually inside of a club. Because these are the sound of the inside of the club, and this is the sound of the direct radiation of the bass. Because you know how when you're listening to a bassist, you hear the bassist directly in front of you, and you also hear the bass coming from all around you, and there's a slight delay? That's what these are for. And that's why these aren't rounded, but are instead elliptical. So, back to these guys right here. Notice how this is flat, and this is the flare. So this would be functioning just like the way that the other thing did. So they basically took the Z-flex and placed it right here. They cut off the whole entire portion of the driver here, and they just expanded this part and made it bigger and got rid of the actual surround. This thing also has the shadow flare, which is pretty cool, because you actually look at the shadow flare, the amount of detail is pretty neat in that it's round except for on the top. The top is actually flared outward right here, because this is actually a copper hood. And it's, since we put us together, it wasn't like perfectly for some reason I think the XQ drivers are just a tiny bit bigger. But you can see a little bit of the green copper patina right on top of it. matter how much this thing pistons, it always gets its support from the top, and this thing right here anchors the imaging to make sure that no matter how much that this thing does happen to blast, the imaging remains coherent with its matching twin. So they started playing with the idea of getting rid of this flat portion and expanding the flare and expanding the horn and getting rid of this thing, actually using the center. So this, I never upgraded the center, it didn't really bother to, it didn't really matter. But notice how the flat portion, the flare, actually comes out all the way here, and the flat portion starts only about right here. But the surround is actually a unique surround. This isn't the normal butyl surround right here. This is the normal butyl surround. This surround actually is a continuity of the woofer. See how there's actually a line right there? So this thing actually continues being a woofer all the way up to here. So you still get that flat portion right here. And then the flare right there. And this thing doesn't have the tangerine waveguide yet. So that's how it started off. And then it moved to here. And then basically it just went like this. Ooh, ooh. Yeah. So the flat portion turned out to be the Z-flex. And now there's no longer a flat portion actually on the woofer itself. The whole entire thing is a flare. And not only did this allow for the elimination of the surround, but allowed for the thing that we call a surround to be a portion of the woofer itself. And it's only bounded by the outside. And that's pretty much the only way it's a surround. And you'll notice that a lot of the speakers, like the R series, don't even have surrounds anymore. Like the Blade doesn't have a surround. And it all really they started playing with it here too, where they actually have this outer rim right here that actually allows for frequencies to jump over this surround and strike this little internal curve. This little internal curve right here is actually something that's being experimented on again when they prototype this to make the new T series. The new T series is actually a lot more interesting than it seems. Especially if you buy the new T series, you have to put it on a wall. Put them on a wall. They do not work otherwise. They sound like crap otherwise. They have to be on a wall because the woofer is actually pretty much an inverted Uni Q, and the tweeter part is just meant to, like, you know, give it extra dispersion. But when placed against a wall, it's able to unify the whole entire front and sound like pretty much an electrostat. And yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. If you get the T series, the only reason you're getting that is because you don't want to install a speaker actually into your walls. You want a speaker that is pretty much like an infinite baffle speaker that is placed up against your wall. That sounds like it just disappears into your wall and sound just emanating from the wall itself. But yeah, that's pretty much like the whole evolution of how KEF and how KEF rebooted itself. And how even things like Mediatek got its origin story from this. When they say that the Mediatek is a black hole, an acoustic black hole, that's exactly the same thing as the fins and the air between the fins behind this woofer and the gap behind the tweeter with the vents around the outside. The way that these are wider on the outside than they are on the inside actually forces air to be sucked out of the back side of the tweeter, and it forces air to be loaded into between the fins, and it forces the fins to basically resonate and strum. And basically what is being done now with Mediatek is that it's not just just like this thing, I guess. I don't know if I'm just covering trade secrets at this point, but just like how this thing's actually meant where the port is not just being used to increase the bass. You can actually plug the hole and the bass doesn't really change. All it does is it increases the amount of spaciousness. That's what the hole is for. The hole is there to basically make it into like a controlled open baffle speaker. And same thing applies here. And that's why the hole on the back of this thing is like, we have the port on the side and it has such a gigantic mouth. Is that this thing's supposed to also operate like an open baffle speaker. And it has that flexi port on the back with it also feed elliptical port so that it could play as broadband as possible. Because as you know, a port that's rounded will send the same sound, same tone through. But a port that is elliptical won't. It's gonna send a much wider range of frequencies through, and it's gonna tend to send a certain set of frequencies. And I believe those are 1 and the 1/5 and the 1/8 and the 1/9. So basically the power chord and a few other sounds that we actually like to hear. So it controls the back of the speaker to play sounds out of the port that not only allow for the sound of the room to come alive from the back of the speaker and fill your room with the sound of the recorded room, but it does so using the front of the speaker at the same time. So you're able to basically be as if you're listening to a person, like, you know, singing in a tunnel, where you hear the person directly and you hear the person resonating from the tunnel at the same time. So yeah, so anyway, I'm just covering pretty much like how KEF got to where they are. And yeah, if you get a pair of these, with a matching pair of these on each side, you're set pretty much as far as like getting like really good spatial audio, like 3D spatial stereo audio. And the thing I'm mostly afraid of right now is things like Atmos and Dolby and licensing, is because they have the capability of taking away the actual spatial cues and selling it back to you. So there's a warning. Stereo naturally has 3D cues. The Gear VR on the Samsung Galaxy, that thing was capable of playing 24-bit low, like basically zero latency audio, and that's how they're able to make the Gear VR even work, so that you would actually be able to shake your head and the movements of your head and the visuals and the audio would be in sync, and it would sound 3D. It'd be spatial. It'd be, they call that binaural when it's actually like used as headphones, right? When you hear 3D through headphones. But stereo is actually supposed to be just as stereophonic. It's not biphonic. It's not monaural. It's not, you know, monophonic and biphonic. It's monophonic and stereophonic. And so that's the reason why I made the Nintendo video, was to show, because Nintendo has left Dolby behind basically back after GameCube, I believe. And once they started with the DS, they started the new audio platform, and it allowed them to pretty much create their own like independence as far as like their ability to make ampliphonic sound. And they continue to make ampliphonic sound to the point where when you're listening to, I'm playing Tears of the Kingdom right now, and when I do a sound test, it plays it plays 6 chimes as if it's playing 5.1 for compatibility with receivers, but it doesn't care. It's just playing all its sound. Just like when it's playing out of the handheld now, the newer OLED is capable of playing all its sound. It no longer plays just the front left and front right anymore. It plays actually 3D spatial surround even in handheld mode. Whereas the old Switch couldn't handle all that sound, and like it wasn't able to be any stutter at all with sound would, you know, be something that would completely just shut the door on like the idea. So they just made sure that this thing worked, and it worked fine on TV, but they, you know, in your hands it would just play, you know, things that pan left and right. And they would have like things like, you know, the haptic feedback and the little oscilloscope, like in in Breath of the Wild, like that thing, the spectrogram, and that would help you basically if you needed to find like things that were around you. And now everything basically is stereophonic, even when you have two speakers. And check it out for yourself. If you have like your settings for your speakers improper, like if you don't have your speakers calibrated and positioned properly, the sound of your Nintendo Switch should actually sound as good as Atmos. You should be able to sound rain above you. You should be able to hear like things fly over you. Your Noble should actually, you know, blast forward and then land like right next to you, to your side, or to your right shoulder, or to your rear left shoulder. And that's just normal stereo. And Nintendo is an impartial observer because they are just making their own like audio engine. They aren't related to Dolby, they aren't related to THX or anything. They're just making amophonic audio stereo sound. And it works on headphones, it works on just two mains, but they also made it so that it could output as 6 channels, just so that it could be compatible with a surround sound receiver, which is the only reason why they have the 5.1 lossless PCM mode. But you notice that even with that, it's lossless PCM, which means that when you do like a 180 churn, it sounds exactly as clear as if you're in VR and you do a 180 churn. It's not that old like Dolby trick where like the background just sounds like kind of like a fuzzy haze. It's actually completely clear, as clear in front of you as it is behind you. And basically the way that it works is, the reason most people think that stereo sound is just in front of you, even though we all know about the Vanishing Act and we all know about like the Phantom Center, is because we all tend to put our speakers in front of us while we hear the room to the rear of us. So that gives us the illusion that we're only immersed halfway forward. If you actually got full immersion from your speakers, where it actually was able to play loud enough where the out of phase sounds bounced off your walls, and you mostly heard, and you were able to override the sound of your room with the acoustics of the recording, the out of phase recording, and then also hear sound directly from the mains, you would actually hear complete 3D sound, even above and below you, because there's no reason why you wouldn't, because that's how the cross microarray works, and they're meant to model after your own ears, which you have 2 of. And yeah, so I'll link my binaural recording of Zelda and my impromptu death dive, where I just like last minute just do my saving grace puff, just based off of using the whooshing of the air after this. Anyway, thanks, and basically fight for stereo. Don't let them take away stereo and convince you that stereo is just stuff panning left and right, because it's never been that. Ever since, you probably remember when you plugged in your headphones partially into an audio jack and heard this kind of out of phase sound. That's what the 3D sound of the stereophonic recording is. It's that plus the left, plus the foreground, basically. And now that everything's digital, it's just that easy for them to just remove the background and sell it back to you as Atmos. And the Atmos button is kind of a scary button, because it's like, if it could give it to you, it could take it away. It makes it seem as if it's like, something that it's producing, when it's not producing at all. Stereo is actually what, it's just like in the original ads. Stereo, it is the sound of reality, is what they used to say. Anyway, thanks.